right. Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome to another Learning Tech Talks, where we are continuing to explore the landscape of learning technology while cutting through the fluff. Today's going to be a different, little bit of a bend from tech. It is and it isn't, because we're crossing the boundaries of tech while at the same time talking about what I think is probably one of the most fundamental soft skills, power skills, people skill, whatever you want, human skills, whatever you want to call it. We're talking about storytelling, excuse me. Storytime's the name of the episode, I think. And I'm joined by Aaron Alpert. He has been on the show before, so he's a veteran to this. This is not new to him. He is with Simpleshow. So we'll be talking a little bit about what Simpleshow does and how they take storytelling to another level, but we're also going to be talking about why this skill is so important and really what you can do to grow it. Because if you're playing really anywhere in corporate, in learning, in anything, storytelling can be extremely valuable. So as we get started here, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to get people engaged. We're going to do some fun stuff along the way like we always do. So while you're joining in, go ahead and comment and tell me where you're located. And Aaron, I'm also we were talking about this before we went live, but I'm going to ask you anyway, so everybody else knows, where are you right now?
So I'm actually in sunny South Florida. Our U.S. headquarters is in Miami, but of course things have changed. So most of our team is remote now. There's only a couple people scattered through our office, but I do happen to come into the office because I live right down the street.
So what's funny is I remember we were just talking about this a few minutes ago, that last time the pandemic had actually just started, and we were joking about, I remember joking with you and Paul about this. We're going like, how long is this going to last? And you were both sitting on opposite ends of the office, and now you're back. But so is the office less populated? You said a lot of folks are just staying remote.
Yeah, it's much less populated, and luckily we've been pretty successful with our team and establishing rules for working remote, and it's been going pretty well. So at the moment we haven't required anyone to come back, but there's some empty seats here. So
okay. more room for you, and I think you were playing ping pong or pool or something with Paul before the last show, so you can get another pool table if you need to.
Yeah, we got a table.
That's what it was. It was pool. I knew it. Okay, so for the icebreaker is a different variation than usual this time. It's going to be fun because we're on the topic of storytelling. So we thought we'd open up the palettes. We'd make this a little fun. I have a feeling we're going to have some fun with this along the way. So we're actually going to do tongue twisters to get make sure we can get this rolling and have some fun along the way. So I'm going to start with some easy ones, and then they're going to progressively get harder. So Aaron, in addition to the fact that I'm not just asking you like a question to get to know you, we're going to see how well you can say your tongue twisters. Okay. All right. So let's start with this. All right, the first one is, and again, if you're watching and you have a really great tongue twister, feel free to comment in and maybe we'll even try and say it. But let's start with this one, okay? So, unique New York. And you got to say it 5 times. So, unique New York, unique New York, unique New York, unique New York, unique New York. Let's see if you can do it.
Okay, let's go. 3, 2, 1. Unique New York, unique New York, unique New York, unique New York, unique New York. Ooh.
All right, I'll give you a C- on that, Aaron. That was a C-. That was a C-. You got to practice that one. All right, this one you don't have to do it 5 times. How can a clam cram in a clean cream can?
How can a clam cram in a clean cream can? Little better.
What? You're getting better. That was like, I'll give you like a B on that one, maybe a B-. Okay, this one's hard. I'll see if I can even do it. Which Swiss wristwatch? This Swiss wristwatch.
Which Swiss wristwatch? This Swiss wristwatch.
We're going down. We're going downhill on this. All right. A little longer. Brisk, brave brigadiers brandish broad, bright blades, blunderbusses, and bludgeons, balancing them badly.
Oh man, this is gonna be an F. I already feel it. Brisk, brave brigadiers brandish broad, bright blades, blunderbuss and bludgeon balancing them badly.
That was better. That was better than the which Swiss wristwatch. This
Yeah.
Swiss wristwatch. That one's tough. All right, and then the last but not least, and then we'll switch the gears into the discussion. I slit a sheet I slit, upon a slitted sheet I sit.
Who comes up with this stuff? I slit a sheet I slit, upon a slitted sheet I sit. Ooh.
You know what? You get to go home with the A+ on that one because you landed. You know what? Might have been a little bumpy off the pommel horse, but you nailed the landing. So I would say, well done, Aaron, on that one, and thanks for playing along.
That was fun.
All right. That was fun. I agree. That was fun. All right. So let's shift gears a little bit because we're talking about storytelling as a skill, but also we're going to talk about how does that then translate into not only just in words, but also in images, which I think is taking storytelling to a whole nother level. But while I remember my conversation with you and got to know a little bit about you, people who may be watching or listening may not necessarily know your background because while you're at Simpleshow, head of what's your role at Simpleshow again?
I'm the creative director at Simpleshow.
The creative director, right? So the creative director of Simpleshow, but you also had history in film and theater. Tell me a little bit about what ended up bringing you to Simpleshow and how that background ties to storytelling.
Yeah, so I actually have a film background. So as a kid, I always wanted to be a filmmaker and script writer. But as I got into the industry, I had a bunch of one-off roles here and there, and I was finding my footing in the industry until a friend of mine came up to me and was like, hey, like I'm working for this company. They make explainer videos and, they need a writer. So why don't you come on board and be a writer? At the time, there was no company. We were working out of his mom's house. He was the sole native English writer for the German branch of the company. And the U.S. part of the company hadn't been established yet. So he brought me on board, and I was able to use my my knowledge in script writing and storytelling to bring some of these complex topics to life. But it's kind of one of those stories where you kind of, you end up somewhere completely different from where you expected. And I think most people here in learning and development, you don't really grow up thinking like, hey, I want to be a trainer or I want to, be in learning, right? So I kind of just, it fell in my lap.
Okay, got it. So was that something I'm just, again, we're going to trip down memory lane a little bit here, but was that something that growing up that you had a tendency towards that? I mean, what ended up gravitating you to kind of the creative side of script writing, that element of things?
I think it was just, observing things and, really like, the emotional part of storytelling is so important. So you have to have that kind of emotional intelligence of understanding people. And when I just wanted to be in film production, and it just turns out like through my courses that, that script writing was where I excelled the most. So I kind of followed that route from there.
Okay. So it actually started in the writing of it. Was it taking the story and actually turning it into the script of it? Okay. So then, and also just for folks who may not know, let's unpack a little bit what this is, and we'll talk a little bit more about how this has shifted, because what Simpleshow has done as an organization has continued to kind of evolve. Last time we talked, we focused pretty heavily on My Simpleshow, which is the self-service tool that actually helps you create animated videos from a story, but there's also the full service side of things. And so in a 30-second elevator, if you're going up to the top of a building with somebody and they say you work at Simpleshow, what does Simpleshow do? How do you describe it?
I would say that we make topics as simple as possible, but as complex as necessary. And we could either do it for you on the full service side, or you could do it yourself using our animated explainer tool. So, I mean, that was like 15 seconds. So,
You could go up the elevator to like, yeah, you wouldn't even get to the top on that. Okay. So really that's interesting. So well, what's funny about it is taking your complex topic and is making, what did you say? As simple. I
as
like the way you phrased it.
as simple as possible, but as complex as necessary. We understand that there's,
Okay.
you don't want to overly simplify, topics for certain audiences. So that's why, as complex as necessary, but as simple as possible where, we really look at each and every word. We make sure that there's, it's not overly detailed. There's no information that's not necessary in an explanation, because that's when you start to lose engagement from the audience, when you're throwing random things at them or you go off track, right? So as simple as possible, but as complex as necessary.
Well, and what's funny that you bring this up about it, and this is the part that I want to dig into a little bit more as we start unpacking storytelling and what that really means. Because again, I hear in corporate that term gets thrown around a lot. We need to be better storytellers, and I don't think everyone always understands what do we mean when we say that. Like, what actually makes a good story, and how do you actually make a good story with that? But as you look at that, there is this tendency, I feel like, when it comes to stories or when it comes to anything, it turns into a Franken story. And I think that's what you're getting at with the, well, oh yeah, we should also tell people this. And hey, why don't we, while we're at it, we tell this, and pretty soon you've got yourself a pretty atrocious story that is impossible for people to follow. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, there is a science to it to a certain degree. There's a flow to a story that, every good story kind of follows a similar pattern. And then, it's interchangeable. The details within the story can be interchangeable, and you could tell a story in many different ways.
Okay, so let's break that down. Like, let's actually take some time to break this down, because I think this is all going to build. We'll use a learning and development term. We'll scaffold this conversation by laying the framework, and then we'll build on top of it. But when you actually look at, well, let's first define it. So when you think of storytelling as a skill, not like telling a story, but when you hear storytelling as a skill, what actually is storytelling to you? How do you define it?
So there's a couple of different ways, right? So there's like the personal storytelling where I might tell you a story about myself, but there's also in communication, like forming a story, creating a story around your content or information that you want to get across, right? So I kind of forgot the question exactly, but
well, so like, how do you define it? Like when somebody says, what makes up a good story, how do you answer that question? Because you said there's a science to it. So there's some elements that's not just, because I think sometimes people are like, you're such a great storyteller. And it's like, but what is that? What actually makes a great story?
Yeah. I would say one of the key points is really like understanding your audience, right? So you don't want you want to just give them just the right amount of information to get their engagement. So for the target audience, it's reading the room, right? So I'm not going to, go into detail about something that might go over their head that they might not understand. So I think one of the key components is, definitely understanding your audience. Also, you don't want to go too far into the problem because I guess we could talk about the structure of the story a little bit. But the first thing you want to do is kind of introduce the problem before you start talking about the solution. But if you go on and on and on, I see it all the time. People want to talk about the problems in the industry or the problems that, someone might have in their story. You start losing people's engagement there already as well. So you kind of want to like move a story along quickly. But a good story really pulls the strings of the audience and is tailored to them. So that's the simple answer.
Okay. So we're, like I said, we're going to sit and break down. We're going to have a lot of fun with this because I also want to talk about some of the like where storytelling goes wrong, because we've all had that person. And if you don't know this person, you are this person. Just FYI, is the person that we've all known this person who thinks they're a really great storyteller and they tell lots of stories, but they aren't really stories that anybody wants to hear. So, right, like, well, I want to unpack some of this because I think this, like I said, this is an important life skill. And if we can break this down, we can actually hopefully help people get better at this, ultimately contributing to, okay, so how do we do this in corporate learning and development and all this other stuff? But on this one, so the audience piece, because I'm thinking back to your Hollywood days. I'm going to call you like Hollywood Aaron from now on. I think is going to be part of it. Is when you think back to that, as you look at the audience piece, kind of figuring out who your audience is, and I think this is one of the challenges that we deal with in corporate learning and development, is that sometimes you may not know your audience. Specifically, you may not necessarily be targeting a specific audience. And since with the service side of your business, you're doing this, you're working with organizations who say, hey, we have this information, we need to get it to this group, but there might be tremendous diversity in that audience. So like, how do you recommend people figure out what is that right level? Because you can almost get too specialized in a story where it's only going to reach a fraction of a percent of the population because you've dialed in too deep versus, hey, we're just going to go big and hit it wide.
Yeah, I think for a wide audience, you really want to broaden the scope by generalizing things using common ways to pull at people's emotions, something that everyone could relate to. I think those are a few things that you could do. And really, that is a challenge. I see it all the time, and I see it more now. Like I think in the Hollywood days, I think you want to reach everyone. That's pretty much you want to reach the largest audience possible.
Well, yeah, because in Hollywood you're putting together a movie, and so your goal is to obviously capture the attention of the masses. But in a corporate setting, if you're like, hey, we're rolling out a new return to office policy, or how do we put together this widget type of a thing, that's not necessarily going to be targeted at everyone.
Yeah. So again, when we're talking about a large audience, you want to broaden the scope. So if it's about you want everyone to return to the office, and you want to create some content around that, right? Maybe a video, I think would be a good idea. Why it would be important for everyone to return to the office. Maybe, we could tell a story about someone who's working remote and might be isolated, even though everyone might not feel that way. Those are emotions that people, understand as well. So bringing people together to, formulate the story from there. And now that everyone's in the office, we're working better together, really going to the why of being in the office might.
So I want to talk about this emotional piece because I was actually in a discussion this week talking about this, and this has become common territory now that used to be very uncomfortable territory for a lot of folks, talking about the squishy emotional side of things in the corporate setting. I mean, I even remember being in a meeting a while back. It was a while back, but it was like, leave your emotions at the door. This is work. And I never agreed with that statement. But even now, I think what I've seen in 2020 and beyond is we're actually seeing this kind of emotional side of things come into play much more. So, you talk about having that emotional connection. Why, from your perspective, why is that such an important component to the story?
Yeah, well, as emotional beings, we automatically connect to different emotions. There is science to it. I can't speak to the science exactly, but part of your brain, right, when you once you hear someone else's story, it tickles a part of your brain that you feel, that emotion as well as you're recalling that emotion. And that's what gets your engagement going when someone's telling the story. So that's the key part. I mean, you really want to, get their attention right away if you're telling someone a story. If not, if they miss the first part, they might miss, the entire context of the story, right? So the emotional part is very important, and you don't, have to be too specific. You could be very general. People are confused about this, and now, with this solution, they're not as confused anymore. It makes their job a lot easier, right? So people who are watching this video or reading this document, they might be like, oh, well, yeah, I am a little confused about that. So this is, they make that connection with the content.
You know, it's interesting over the years of doing this and learning, because one of the things that I try and do on the professional side is I actually try and spend a fair amount of time talking to the workforce, right? Going out. So for people who are in L&D, I actually made a post about this several weeks ago where it's like, if you're not talking to your audience, you're missing out, because you're missing not only a massive data source, but also some real help in understanding what's going on, and a greater empathy. It's amazing in talking to employees how frequently they feel, going back to this point of why does the emotional piece matter? One, it's the hook. It's the hook, if I'm hearing you. It's the hook that actually kind of pulls you in. But the number of times I've heard people say, I have no idea why this matters to me. I can't relate to it. There's no context. You know, whatever words they use to describe it, that is so often a missing link. We're so busy trying to tell people the what, we forget to tell them the why. And when we do that, I've seen just time and time again, it just goes right over their head and they miss the whole piece. And I think that, you know, you tell me, you're writing way more stories than I have with what you're doing there. But I have to imagine that contextual piece. I have to imagine you get people that come and go, hey, here's all the stuff people need to know. And you've got to kind of pull out of them the why. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very good point. That's, you know, really one of the most important parts in getting an engagement, right? And engagement is what leads to, you know, to retention, and people start, you know, remembering the information and retaining, you know, the what is because they're engaged and they're listening and they understand why it's important to them. So, yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. So we talked about kind of the audience analysis piece. And again, I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you could probably go as broad or narrow as you need to with that. It's just really about, if I heard you correctly, it's about actually analyzing and figuring out who they are. It's not necessarily you have to have one specific audience type. It's just a matter about taking the time to figure out who that group is. Is that a fair assessment on that end? Because obviously you're writing Hollywood movies to masses.
Yeah.
There wasn't one necessary persona.
Yeah, the more you can narrow it down to a certain group, you know, that it makes it easier, right? The broader the audience, it makes it a little bit more difficult to ensure that they're all engaged throughout. But I think naturally we're always reading the room. I mean, when you're talking to somebody and just in a conversation, you're explaining, you know, how you know your day went or something to somebody, like they might not know everyone that you interacted with. So then to that person, you would want to go into a little bit more detail on who this person is and, you know, who this colleague is that was giving me problems today or something, you know.
Okay. So then we got that. Then we broke down the piece about kind of the whole contextualizing the emotional side of things. One of the other ones I'm curious what you've seen, and I've got a perspective on this, so this will be a back and forth. But I have to imagine in the role you're in, you probably get a lot of people that come to you with stuff like a lot of information, and it's like, here's 387 pages of context. Can you make that a 5-minute explainer video for us? So I'm curious, on your side, how do you actually break that down? Like, what are some of the things that you can, because this is tough, and sometimes it goes back to your phrase that you said before, and I'm going to memorize this by the time you're done. Simple enough, something, whatever that one is. Right, but like, how do you find that right degree of complexity? Because that is a balancing act that I would say many struggle with, especially in our industry. We're dealing with this all the time. So we have subject matter experts coming to us going, hey, here's this 387-page PowerPoint deck. Can you go deliver this? And we're left going, okay, we got to figure out what in this is even relevance.
Yeah. So you're right. I see that all the time. And the more content we get, probably the more stories we would create from it. But if they really... we're adamant about making it. Our videos are typically 3 minutes or less, but if they wanted to make that one explainer video, we would really. It takes a lot of work. It's not easy, but a lot of back and forth with clients about, you know, what the key points should be highlighted. And I think, you know, you were going to ask me about this later, but using visuals, you could say a lot using visuals. So you might not have to script each and every word or each and every detail, but using some simple visuals, you could say a lot more too. So that's part of animation. And then we also chunk things up. I think we spoke about this a little bit on our last call, our last meeting, and we chunk things up and we create interactive experiences as well, where, you know, we have different chapters, different stories throughout, and try to tie it in with, you know, some key elements into one learning module.
Okay. So you're breaking it down, not necessarily cutting everything out. It sounds like it's kind of a mix of the two. It's the actual breaking it down, but then also cutting some of the pieces out of it. Fair?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, and I think this has been one of the things that continues to be. I don't know that in our industry you're ever going to get over this, because I know for myself, I still deal with this, where you get tons of information and it's figuring out how to break it down to the complex. So on the visual side, because that's a big part of what you're doing with Simpleshow, is you're actually not only just figuring out the scripting piece, but before, actually, you know what? I'm going to take a step back, because I actually am curious about this on the language side. When it comes to writing it, I have to imagine you're doing some of these on very complex topics. How much does the language that people are using matter? And how much time do you spend actually simplifying the language out of that? And are there any best practices you have for how to actually make the language resonate best?
Yeah, so we find ourselves working with pharmaceutical companies quite a bit, and sometimes they need to explain things.
There's a lot of complexity there. I spent a good time in pharma. There's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah, and sometimes we're explaining, you know, how a drug might work to the entire company, right? And then that's when you really have to dumb down the language to something that everyone could understand. Sometimes we're explaining that same thing to just the sales team, and the sales team might have a pretty good level of knowledge, not a PhD level of knowledge in the field. So we need to work with them to find that middle ground of like what, you know, what they might already know, and, you know, and what might be the most digestible route. And then sometimes we're even explaining things to lab technicians and other, you know, other professionals in within the organization that have a much higher level of knowledge. And then we just have to do a lot of research on our own to make sure that we have a thorough understanding of the type of verbiage that's being used throughout. But a lot of times I see that, you know, they're like, oh, you have to say it like this, you have to say it like that. But there might be a simpler way to say it. So, you know, so sometimes, you know, you really want to like take a step back. But because we're coming in with a fresh perspective and we're learning this for the first time, it gives us a unique perspective, right? Because we're learning it, so we get to kind of turn that experience around and explain it in a simple manner.
Okay. So this one's a interesting one, and I want to talk a little bit about this, because I do often see the tendency, and I don't know where it comes from. So I'm curious if you deal with this, especially you talked about it from a pharma standpoint. I feel like I see this in a lot of places. You go on LinkedIn, you see this happen all the time, where people are using intentionally really big, complicated words. We're describing things with lots of corporate-y buzzwords to fill in the gaps type of stuff. It sounds really fancy, and it may make people not necessarily really, they might just nod their head, but really they have no idea what you're talking about. But there can be a real resistance to changing that. And sometimes trying to push the, hey, we need to make this more simple. I don't know about you, but like I've gotten pressure back from that, because people actually almost feel comfortable saying, but this is really complicated, and they don't necessarily want to simplify it. I'm just curious how you manage that, or what are some of the things that you've done? Because I've found, I personally do not think the complexity adds anything to the conversation. If anything, it just makes it more difficult.
Yeah, no, I understand what you mean, and it's definitely it definitely happens often, right? Where these certain buzzwords have to be used, and I don't really understand them completely, and the audience probably doesn't understand them completely.
But they want to pretend they do, because they don't want to admit they don't know what you're saying. So they go, oh yeah, that sounds great. Neuroscience and artificial intelligence, machine, yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, and that happens, I think, particularly in tech. these buzzwords are go over people's heads. So I mean, what we try to do is we try our best, we go back and forth, but another thing that really helps is finding that right visual or combination of visuals that could also explain it, right? Instead of just, like an icon of a user, maybe you want to explain, a little bit more about like how that user might be integrated into the system using visuals or something like that.
Okay.
Integrate.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I think it's a solid recommendation and strategy on this point, which is, because sometimes you can't win. Like sometimes there's just no way to win that conversation. And so what you're saying is when you run into that, the visual can be a representation to say, we know nobody's going to have any clue what's being said right now, but at least we can find this visual that then shows what we're saying to help people contextualize it.
Yeah, sometimes when you struggle, explaining something to someone, you're like, all right, let me just pull out a piece of paper and a pen, and you just draw it out to them or something, direction, for example. But yeah, I think a simple visual can do a lot when you're communicating.
Okay. So I want to go from there. So we talked about the audience. We talked about kind of the language behind it, the emotional piece. I do want to talk about the structure. We can kind of talk a little bit about the structure because I've heard, I cannot, and I'm not going to Google it because then I'll get distracted during the conversation. But isn't it something like there's only like 8 stories really in the world or something like that? And then there's just different variations of 8 stories. I cannot remember what the statistic is. But isn't it something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it is something like that. I don't know the exact statistic either, but I've heard it before. And yeah, I mean, like a lot of the stories that we see and we hear are very similar. They're similar beginning, middle, and end to these stories. But, the characters or the context might change, right?
Okay. So then on that, as we shift over to what you do at Simpleshow, which a big part of that is now not only taking this, because again, I think there's a lot of the art behind even getting the story straight, getting the structure straight, figuring out your audience, figuring out what is the right degree of complexity behind this. But then now we're adding in this visual layer to it on top of it. So now you got this whole visual side of things. Talk to me a little bit about that in that sense, because it's one thing to tell a good story. It's another thing to show a good story. And that's now adding another layer of, simplicity while at the same time complexity to storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak to that quite a bit. So I think, people, there's that saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. But we like to say that like a simple illustration is worth just the right amount of words. So sometimes a picture just has too much data in it. So people, they ask us all the time if in their video or in their module or in the tool that you could just upload your own image and they want to put an actual picture, but there's so much data in that picture. Like just if I picture you right now, there's a plant in the background, there's some artwork, there's a lot of other things. But if we're just talking about Christopher, maybe
you're talking about Fred? You're talking about Fred over here?
But if we're just talking about Christopher, we might not want to use this picture, but maybe the scribble that we created for you that's in your signature. So that's why I think using simple images helps quite a bit. They stick in your memory. It helps retain the information, and a person could if they see a simple image, they can recognize that image in a split second. But when you're talking about a block of text, they have to read that block of text, and it takes seconds, multiple seconds. So I would say, yeah, simple images are definitely a good way.
I want to go deeper on this one because it is one of the things that's interesting. So I'm familiar with the videos you guys put together in terms of not only the tool itself, but the videos. Is you do have these, right? Like you said, there's simple animations, there's simple doodles in some regards of things. And I was curious about that in terms of if that was intentional or accidental, because it sounds to me like that's an intentional choice to say, yes, we're going to do a visual, but we're not going to draw or bring in an actual real picture for a reason. Is that accurate?
Exactly. Yeah. So And that's because what I was saying, like the human brain could recognize, a simple image and connect the dots themselves in their own brain. So you could say less if you're using simple images, right? And something, like more robust, like a picture or video footage or something like that has a lot more data in it that might cause further distraction and not really focus on the key points that you're trying to get across.
Okay. So let me ask you this, because this is one of the things. So I've got a lot of different directions I want to go with this. So we'll see how many we get through in the like 20 minutes we have left or whatever. But on this one, I remember when I first started doing work with animation in learning and development, and some of the challenges that I occasionally got that I had to overcome was it was perceived as cartoony. I will never forget the first time that I brought in animations into things and people said, oh, those are cartoony. I don't that's not professional. That's not corporate. And I really had some work to do to help bring people along for the ride to say, that's on purpose. Like there's a reason behind that. So I'm curious if you ever, I mean, obviously people are coming to you for animated videos, so they may be further along, but I'm just curious if you ever run into that where they almost want to sterilize some of the fun out of it versus say, no, this is designed to be simple and fun and engaging in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much answered the question for me. You definitely have some experience in the field, and really speaking about the importance of the simple imagery. We do, add some color accents as well. We even have we could even make custom images for people. But in regards to just communicating the importance of simplicity, it's like we just really want to focus on the key points. It's not really about the image; it's about the message. So this is the way to really get people engaged throughout, because there's less distraction, there's less color, there's less flair. So our simplistic black and white style is always something that we push, and it's still our most popular.
Yeah, I was even going to ask from a color standpoint, because
Yeah.
again, you talked about the fact that, okay, so let's say we put a picture, my picture in something. The possibility is somebody gets distracted by the United States back here. They get distracted by Fred in the corner, and oh, he has earbuds in, right? Suddenly that becomes a distraction versus the animation. But now what you're talking about is even to some degree, color can actually serve as a distraction versus it just is interesting to me that your black and white is actually still one of the most popular, even though from a flair standpoint, it may not necessarily be as like in your face, but that might be, again, be an intentional move.
Yeah, exactly. Like any additional data that doesn't help the explanation can be a distraction, right? So like that's pretty much the simple answer. But if you just have like one singular color accent throughout, I think clients come to us all the time and they want custom illustrations, or they want to add color to to their images, and sure, like we could absolutely do that, and that's a branding thing, and but sometimes too much color could just add more data that's not necessary to a simple explanation. And I guess maybe we're kind of going away from storytelling a little bit, but
in a way we are, but we aren't, because I think ultimately this goes back to, and I actually did a talk earlier this week, and the term I used was relentless intentionality, right? It was about being relentlessly intentional about what you're doing. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about, which is an important characteristic of a story, is what are you trying to do? And then what's the best and simplest way to accomplish that? And don't let the other things distract, which actually I think does tie into what we're talking about from a storytelling, which is if you're trying to tell this story, you're trying to communicate this very complex subject, is adding this color, adding to that story, adding to your objective, or is it actually taking away from it? Is it actually pulling your attention in a direction you actually don't want people's attention drawn?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, and I think that sometimes color is necessary. but only when it really helps the explanation. And if you are using color in your story, I would recommend, one accent color and not like a dozen colors throughout, right? Like have a unified look and feel. That might be a little bit flashier. People might get bored of seeing the black and white things over and over again. So adding some color to it, and then we also have a range of different illustration styles that could be a little bit more serious and less cartoony.
Okay.
But yeah, I think the black and white is still the best way to simplify something and to get a message across in a simple manner.
Well, and it goes back to, I just continue to think about this kind of being intentional about what you're trying to do. And again, for anybody watching that's in learning and development, or I mean, I know we have marketing people, things like this. It can be easy to get sucked up and distracted with the, ooh, I like this, or I do that, versus, hey, what are we trying to accomplish here? And how do we remove all of the noise, or as much noise as possible? Which even I think from a user experience design standpoint, whether you're designing a visual for anything, whether it's an animated video or anything like that, your point of, well, if you have 37 different colors and 9 different fonts and a bunch of different mediums of things going into here, it's actually adding confusion and noise to the message you're trying to convey to someone, which is actually pulling them away and actually reducing that. And the other thing, my wife tells me this all the time about some of the stuff that I do, where she's like, you understand what you're trying to do, but nobody else has all the context you do. So while you may look at that and go, oh, I picked this color and this color and this, they don't know that. And so to them, then it becomes a distraction.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, so let me also ask you on this one, when it comes to the visual stuff, because you talked a little bit about the simple visuals and how do you communicate as directly as possible with whatever it is. So I'm looking right at the cool chalkboard design. I need a background like you have, honestly. Like this is, Fred in the US is boring compared to what you have. Yeah, good grief. You guys did my email signature. I need you to redo my branding. The thing you guys did with the show this week was fantastic as well. But with this, when it comes to the visual side of things, I think there's also always this potential for trying to push it to be too specific. And I have to imagine you've been in conversations like this before where it's like, no, can you make it? I'm thinking of like the little guy holding the megaphone behind you. Like, can the megaphone be in his right hand instead of his left hand? And he be wearing shoes with shoelaces? And that kind of stuff, and trying to get it so perfect versus saying, hey, does this genuinely communicate the concept we're trying to communicate? How do you walk that line? Because we talked about it a little bit with color, but I think there has to even be that kind of intentionality behind the very object that you're referencing.
Yeah, so I guess so the question is, how do we find that?
Yeah, like how do you strike that right balance? Because you talked about the fact that sometimes you'll do custom animations, and when do you kind of help balance that? I don't know that doing the custom animations is adding what you would want it to do. Like, how do you walk that line?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there are some topics that really need a custom illustrations. We did a project recently on a surgical procedure and the tool sets, and it was about how to it was like all the tool sets are polished like metals, right? So in black and white it would be hard to show the shine and the bend and and the forks and all that, and then also the surgical procedure included like skin and muscle and bone, and it's hard to show all that with black and white. So that's when I would say, hey, let's go with a custom illustration style for this. But yeah, I think really the simpler the better, as simple as possible again, but as complex as necessary. It kind of goes back to that message. If you could make something simple, then go with the simple route, and only make it complex when it's necessary.
Okay. Well, and in the example you talked about, this goes back to the intentionality behind it. The medical procedure one you talked about, you're talking about the fact that part of the story was the shine on the object or the detail in the muscle. That's part of the story.
Yeah.
So stripping that out of the visual then actually takes away from the story. Having it in is actually adding to the story. Versus if you're saying a picture of a house, it's not about the shingles or the number of windows or the color of the door, because it's more just a representation of a domicile type of a thing versus the actual kind of house. So I think that again goes back to that point of, hey, what are you really trying to communicate and how are you doing that?
Yeah, exactly. And that story was actually about how the tool set, the new tool set, is being used for this procedure, and the differences between the old tool set and why that's beneficial to and makes the surgical procedure much easier. But the tools look very similar, but because of little things like the bend and the way that it clasps onto the skin, and little things like that were differentiators, and we wanted to highlight that
Okay.
for this particular client.
Okay. Got it. So then I actually am really curious, like from a process standpoint, because I think this is one of the things where sometimes bad storytelling just comes from not taking the time to think through your story. I'm just curious from a process standpoint, as you look at the way you work, because again, that's what Simpleshow does. You're literally in the business
Yeah.
of storytelling is what you do. You take people's information and you turn it into a compelling story that can then be communicated out to people in ways. From a process standpoint, what does that look like? Like when you actually take somebody from soup to nuts through that, I think we kind of hit on it, but I'm
Yeah.
just curious, like front to end, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, we always try to start from the highest level possible, and get some simple information through a few questions, a handful of questions. Who's the target audience? So, like, who are you really speaking to? What are the key points you want to get across? And then then we'll get all the content. It might be 100 pages or 1 page or a deck or something like that.
100 pages.
Yeah, it happens all the time, right? And then we cross-reference that, and we try to put things into a perspective. We'll create a character in a story, right, that is relevant to the target audience. That's why it's one of the first questions that we ask. And we...
So hang on, I'm going to stop you because this is my style anyway. So the character piece, I actually want to kind of pull on that because I don't think we actually hit. So the character is one of the first pieces that you focus on, is like, who is the character in the story?
Yeah, that's one of the first pieces, because if you highlight a character or you tell things through the perspective of someone who's in a similar situation as the target audience, right? If you put things into perspective through that character, then you're going to get their engagement. And then it's much easier to say the why through someone who you relate to than through just anybody off the street or somebody who might not be relevant to the process.
Okay. Well, and it's funny you bring that up because I think, I just think back to, I won't mention where, but it was a similar experience. And I think just to kind of validate what you're saying with that, there was a huge project that I was working on, and again, I think this goes back to a tendency that you probably deal with where people just come with information. It's like,
Yeah.
here's information. Can you come up with an abbreviated script and some cool widget visuals to just communicate this information? And what you're saying is go back to who is the main character in this story, and let's actually create a persona around them. And again, when I was doing an initiative behind this, I created Anne, and I remember doing it and going, this is Anne, and here's what Anne is doing and what she's experiencing and again, to your point, it actually creates those points of relevance that you can then start to contextualize. All right, well, what is this story? And start to strip out the stuff that's not relevant, put in the things that are, and things like that. So again, like I said, I know I jumped in on the process piece, but I think it was an important piece to highlight, because I do agree that that's a critical component of storytelling, is who is the character in here? Who are the characters potentially?
Yeah, exactly. And recently we gave out awards to some of our video maker tool users. So we had like a couple hundred people submit videos that they created for their workplace, and a small team of us watched these videos, and the handful of ones that really stood out were the ones that used some semblance of storytelling, right? And they had that character, and they had somewhat of like an arc to their story. And then there was other ones that they were just like, here's information, and it was just hard to follow, especially for me, who isn't necessarily tied to the content, right? It doesn't really have any of the background information. But the ones who showed that story and that arc they had a character and they showed it through the eyes of that character. Those were the ones that stood out, and there was a handful of them.
And again, now thinking about it, we probably could have brought this up earlier because we could probably have a full episode just on this topic. But I mean, I think this is the reason I think it's worth unpacking on here a little bit is to that point. And it's almost a good exercise I'm just thinking to the people who would watch and listen to this, right? Instructional designers, people like that who are thinking about this, the exercise of actually coming up with the character and thinking through what is that story actually does help you strip out some of the things that we just unintentionally do when we're creating things where we just put information in, because it actually forces you to put yourself in the shoes of that person. Going back to, I think, learner-centered design. We're talking about buzzwords. Learner-centered design is kind of the big thing right now, but that it actually forces you to go into that mode because you start saying, who is this person? What are they dealing with? What do they need to know? And why do they need to know it? And how do we walk them through that story? Not only is it good for the end user, but I think it's actually a valuable skill exercise for people who are going through this process, because, and it makes sense that you would put that on the front end of the process, because you nail that in the beginning. I have to imagine the rest goes, well, I can say from my experience, the rest goes a lot easier.
Yeah, exactly. And again, because when we explain something and we tell a story, we're learning this information for the first time. So the first question on our questionnaire is like, who is the target audience? And then when we get into a briefing call, we're like, who's going to be watching this? Where are they going to be watching this? And what do they already know? Like, did they have problems receiving this information before? What are some of the issues they were having? How is this, solution going to help them overcome these issues? And those are, those are a key, I think it's key to really, telling a good story is really understanding the audience.
Okay. Well, so, all right. So we talked about this. You're getting the information. One of the first things is really kind of outlining that character, and then walk me through like kind of how does it go forward from there?
So yeah, then you want to explain what their problem might be, right? The why, like what we were saying. I think a lot of people go too far or too in depth on the why, and that's because you want to explain yourself all. We have this need to explain ourselves and why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? But a lot of times the audience already knows those things. So if you're telling something to someone that they already know, you're starting to lose their engagement. So you want to kind of like simplify or generalize, what that why might be, and then put the solution into the perspective of this main character, right? So then, we talk about the solution, how that solution might have helped this character overcome the problem that we established. And
hero story, I think that's what it's called.
Exactly. Is that one of the 8? Did you Google it?
No, but I remember the term from somewhere.
Yeah, and this is really like the simplest way of me explaining storytelling, but really then after that it's like how they implemented that solution, and then you want to wrap it up with a happy ending and a conclusion of what life looks like now that they're using this solution. Their life's so much better. And that's a really simple framework to storytelling that we use all the time. And like I said, we did that whole exercise of giving out that award. And and sometimes it gets a little bit redundant using these same storytelling techniques over and over again. But it helped me realize, like, yeah, it's really effective because I saw other ways of revealing information.
Well, and I remember, because I've toyed around with it. I remember the self-service, the My Simpleshow. What do you call it now? What's the new name for it?
Simpleshow Video Maker. Yes.
Simpleshow Video Maker. Okay. I remember one of the things about it is it actually walked you through that storytelling process. It actually helped you do that as part of the design. So the wizard behind it is actually helping you through that process, which to your point, here you watched all these videos that people submitted. And I'm sure, like you said, you're dealing with this all the time to the point where you can start to go, oh my word, like is this just feels like a lot of process, but it works and it matters. And I remember it actually does help you start to create the framework for a good story as you're actually building it out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think still users just like, we don't even have the blank template option on the top left. It's further down on purpose, intentional, right? But people still just see the
Because
blank.
otherwise people will just start packing their stuff in.
Yeah, they just jump right into it. But yeah,
Okay.
it's still important, and it's great to follow those guidelines that will really help you create a good story.
Okay. Well, I think, and I did look it up. There's 12 types. There's 12 story types, not 8. There's 12 story types. But I was right about the hero story, right? That is one. So anyway, but again, I think it's less about all the tactics behind it. I mean, it's important to know all those, but it's actually about going through and the intentionality behind this process, because it is easy, to your point, despite the fact you've buried the blank story template on the bottom. Our natural tendency when it comes to things is, let me just jump right to what I think you need to know type of a thing. Like, let me just jump right to the information, and hopefully, I recently reread the book by Nick Shackleton Jones, How People Learn, about this idea that we think knowledge transfer is the ultimate goal versus how are we actually creating this connection and actually driving behavior change through an emotional experience. So it's such an important piece. And now you're actually doing, I made a note to remind myself of this. You're actually doing some how-to workshops in the future. I don't think the date was official yet, but to actually help kind of clients and intact teams who are trying to master storytelling or improve storytelling, to actually improve on this exercise of, okay, hey, how do you come up with the character? How do you tell the story? How do you actually take this out? How do you pull the visuals together? You're actually doing something like that for people right now, or in the future, correct?
Yeah, so we're working on a presentation, a webinar, so we could go a little further in depth, and I think storytelling doesn't have to be too complex. I think we could simplify it for you and create some stories together. It should be a fun webinar, so keep a lookout for it. And in the next couple months, we should have more information on that.
Okay, got it. And so this will not just be a come listen. It's a kind of actually participate and interact and actually practice your storytelling skills.
Yeah, pretty much, exactly.
Put things to work. Awesome. Well, Aaron, this has been a blast. You guys, like I said, you've been one of my favorite people to have on the show. So I was thrilled to have you back. And you are right. I do have your simple show of me in my email signature, because I think the visuals are great. Like I said, you want to do the decorating on my back wall or redo my branding. I will take you up on that offer any day, because I think you guys are doing some cool stuff with it. And again, it's helping simplify the complex in a way that captures and pulls people's attention. And so thank you for making the time today, for joining me from sunny Florida. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks everybody for tuning in. And we will be back next week, I think is when we're doing it. So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Chris, for always a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully we could do it again soon.
All right. Sounds good. See ya.
All right. How are we going?